The storm had taken everything. Ilara woke to the cruel kiss of sand against her cheek, her body half submerged in shallow water that lapped at her like a patient predator. The sky above was impossibly blue, mockingly peaceful after the fury that had torn her world apart just hours before. She coughed, salt water burning her throat, and forced herself onto her hands and knees. The Meridian's grace was gone. The merchant vessel that had carried her from Port Royal to what should have been Santo Domingo had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. No wreckage floated in the crystalline waters. No voices called out for help. Only silence, vast, suffocating silence broken only by the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. "Hello?" Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. She tried again, louder this time. "Is anyone there? Captain Reeves, Marcus." Nothing answered but the screech of a gull wheeling overhead. Ilara stumbled to her feet, her legs weak and unsteady. Her dress, once a respectable traveling gown of deep green cotton, hung in tatters, torn by wind and wave. She was barefoot. The sea had claimed her boots. Around her neck, miraculously intact, hung the silver pendant she never removed, a circular crest engraved with a ship surrounded by stars and the initials MC. It had belonged to her mother, one of the few possessions she'd managed to keep through years of hardship. The island stretched before her like a question mark. It was small, perhaps half a mile across, covered in tangled vegetation and jagged volcanic rock that rose toward the center like a broken tooth. Palm trees bent toward the water as if trying to escape. In the distance, she could see the endless expanse of the Caribbean Sea stretching to every horizon, without interruption. She was alone, completely, utterly alone. The first day passed in a haze of shock and disbelief. Ilara walked the perimeter of the island, calling out until her voice gave out entirely, searching for any sign of other survivors. She found nothing, no bodies, no supplies, no hope. By nightfall, she'd collapsed beneath a cluster of palms, her body shaking with exhaustion and the first real waves of terror. The tropical heat that had scorched her during the day gave way to a chill that seeped into her bones. She had no fire, no shelter, no fresh water. She would die here. The thought came with startling clarity as she stared up at the unfamiliar constellations. She would die on this nameless scrap of land, and no one would ever know what became of her. But dawn brought something else, the will to survive. Ilara rose with the sun, her body aching but her mind suddenly desperately focused. She needed water first. Without it, she'd last perhaps 3 days. She pushed inland, following the sound of birds, and found salvation in the form of a small freshwater spring trickling from between 2 rocks. She drank until her stomach hurt, then drank more, knowing she couldn't predict when she'd find water again. Food came next. The island offered sparse provisions. Wild figs that grew in twisted abundance near the center, coconuts that required 30 minutes of frustrated effort to crack open against the rocks, and small crabs that scuttled along the tide pools at dawn. She learned to time the tides, to recognize which plants might be edible and which would leave her retching in the sand. Her hands, once smooth and unmarked, became calloused and cut. Her skin burned, then darkened, then burned again. Days blurred together. She built a crude shelter from palm fronds and driftwood, tucked into a natural alcove in the rocks that offered some protection from the afternoon rains that came with startling violence. She learned to predict the weather by watching the clouds build over the eastern horizon. She spoke aloud to herself constantly, reciting poetry, singing half-remembered songs, telling stories to the crabs, anything to combat the crushing loneliness that threatened to swallow her whole. At night, she clutched her mother's pendant and tried to remember what her voice had sounded like. The memories were fading, worn smooth by time and trauma like sea glass. Her mother had died when Ilara was 12, leaving her in the care of an aunt who treated her like an inconvenient obligation. The pendant was all she had left, the crest of some merchant family her mother had served, or perhaps been part of. She'd never known the full story. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. Ilara's dress had deteriorated to the point of uselessness. She'd fashioned a crude garment from sailcloth she'd found washed up on the beach, tying it with strips of dried vine. Her hair, once carefully pinned, now hung in sun-bleached tangles down her back. She'd stopped counting days, stopped imagining rescue. This was her life now, survival measured in hours, in the finding of food and water, in the small victory of making it through another night. She was checking her fishing trap, a construction of woven vines she'd spent 2 days perfecting, when she saw it. At first, she thought it was a hallucination. The isolation had begun to play tricks on her mind. Sometimes she saw ships that weren't there, heard voices in the wind. But this didn't fade when she blinked. On the far horizon, where the sea met the sky in a hazy line of blue, a dark shape had appeared. A ship. Ilara's heart stopped, then exploded into a gallop that made her dizzy. She scrambled up onto the highest rock she could reach, shielding her eyes against the merciless sun. Yes, they're unmistakable now. A vessel, and it was moving closer, cutting through the water with deliberate purpose. She waved her arms frantically, screaming until her throat was raw, though she knew they couldn't possibly hear or see her yet. She ran back to her shelter and grabbed the brightest piece of fabric she owned, a strip of red cloth from her ruined petticoat, and tied it to a long stick, creating a makeshift flag. Back on the rocks, she waved it in wide arcs, a desperate semaphore of survival. The ship continued its approach, growing larger with agonizing slowness. As it drew nearer, details emerged that sent a chill down her spine despite the heat. The sails were dark, not the white or cream canvas of honest merchant vessels, but black as a moonless night. The hull was painted in deep colors that made it blend with the water. And flying from the mainmast was a flag she recognized from nightmares and whispered tavern stories. The Jolly Roger, skull and crossbones stark against black fabric. Pirates. Ilara's flag faltered in her hands. Every child in the Caribbean grew up on stories of pirate cruelty. The raids on coastal towns, the ships taken and burned, the prisoners who were given the choice between joining the crew or walking the plank. Women were treated worst of all, or so the stories went. She thought of the merchant sailors on the Meridian's Grace. Rough men who'd still shown her basic courtesy and protection during the voyage. These men would show her nothing but violence. Yet what choice did she have? Stay on the island and die slowly of starvation and exposure? Or take her chances with the pirates and possibly die quickly, or possibly, just possibly survive? The ship dropped anchor in the deeper water offshore, too large to risk the shallows. Ilara watched, her heart in her throat, as a longboat was lowered and 4 figures climbed down. They rowed toward the beach with practiced efficiency, and she could see them now, men in varying states of dress, all armed, all watching the island with the predatory focus of hunters who'd spotted prey. She should run, hide in the interior, and hope they'd leave without finding her. But her body wouldn't obey. She stood frozen on the rocks, her red flag hanging limp in her hands, as the longboat scraped against the sand and the pirates came ashore. The first pirate to step onto the sand was a giant of a man, easily 6.5 feet tall, with arms thick as ship masts and a beard that hung to his chest in black braids threaded with beads. He carried a cutlass that looked small in his massive hands and wore a leather vest over a bare, scarred torso. His eyes, dark and calculating, swept the beach before landing on Ilara. "Well, well," he rumbled, his accent a mixture of African and Caribbean lilt. "What do we have here? A castaway or bait?" "Bait for what, Kofi?" The second pirate was smaller, wiry, with sun-weathered skin and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. He moved with the coiled tension of a snake about to strike. "You see any ships but ours?" "Could be a trap," suggested the third, a younger man with nervous energy and a pistol that looked too large for his thin frame. "Could be the Navy waiting in them trees." "The Navy doesn't use women as bait, you fool," snapped the fourth pirate, a woman, Ilara realized with surprise. She was perhaps 40, with grey-streaked hair tied back in a severe knot and eyes that held a hardness born of violence survived. And if they did, they'd pick someone who looked less like a drowned rat. Despite everything, Ilara felt a flash of indignation. She knew what she must look like, skeletal from hunger, burned raw by the sun, dressed in rags, but she'd fought too hard to survive to be insulted now. She lifted her chin, gathering the shreds of her dignity. "I'm no bait," she said, pleased that her voice came out steady. "My ship wrecked in the storm 3 weeks ago. I'm the only survivor." The pirates exchanged glances. The big one, Kofi, started forward. But before he could take more than 2 steps, another voice cut through the air like a blade. "Stand down." The command was quiet, but absolute. The pirates froze as another figure emerged from the longboat, and Ilara's breath caught in her throat. He was tall, but not as tall as Kofi, with a build that spoke of lean strength rather than bulk. His skin was bronzed from years under the Caribbean sun, and his hair, dark brown shot through with premature grey, was tied back loosely, exposing a face that was all sharp angles and harder edges. A scar ran down the left side of his face from eyebrow to jaw, pulling slightly at the corner of his mouth. He wore black breeches, tall boots, and a white shirt open at the throat beneath a long coat of deep blue that had seen better days. 2 pistols hung from his belt alongside a sword that looked well used, but it was his eyes that held her captive, grey as storm clouds, holding depths of pain and fury, and something else she couldn't name. He studied her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare, as if he could see through flesh and bone to the very core of her being. "Captain," the woman pirate said, and there was respect in her voice that bordered on reverence. "She claims she's shipwrecked." The captain approached slowly, his gaze never leaving Ilara's face. She wanted to step back, to run, but his eyes held her immobile. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could see the silver threading through his hair, the fine lines around his eyes, the way his jaw was clenched, as if holding back some powerful emotion, and then his gaze dropped to her neck. She saw the change in his expression, the way his eyes widened fractionally, the way the color drained from his face despite his tan, the way his hand moved unconsciously toward his chest as if warding off a blow. He stared at her pendant with an expression of such raw shock and grief that Ilara instinctively took a step back. "Where did you get that?" His voice was rough, almost strangled. Ilara's hand flew to the pendant protectively. "It was my mother's. It's all I have left of her." "Your mother?" He repeated the words as if testing their truth. "What was her name?" Why would you—" "Her name!" The shout made Ilara flinch. The other pirates shifted uneasily, clearly unused to seeing their captain lose composure. He took a breath, visibly forcing control back into his voice. "Please, her name. Marissa. Marissa Cole." The name hit him like a physical blow. He actually swayed, and Kofi moved forward instinctively, though the captain waved him off with a sharp gesture. When he looked at Ilara again, his eyes held a storm of emotions too complex to name. "Marissa had no children," he said finally, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "She told me. She said she was in service to a merchant family in Kingston," Ilara said, confused and frightened by his reaction. "She died of fever when I was 12. I know almost nothing about her life before that, but she gave me this pendant and told me to keep it always, that it was proof of who I was." The captain closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the storm had been locked away behind walls of iron control, but Ilara could feel it raging beneath the surface. He turned to his crew, back to the ship. "All of you!" "Captain," the woman started. "Now, Lucia, that's an order." They obeyed, though clearly reluctant, trudging back to the longboat with frequent glances over their shoulders. Ilara and the captain stood alone on the beach, the surf hissing between them. "Carrying the scent of salt and distant storms, that pendant," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the horizon rather than her face, "was a wedding gift. I commissioned it from a silversmith in Cartagena, had it engraved with my ship's crest and my wife's initials. Marissa Catherine." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I gave it to her the day we were married, 16 years ago. She wore it always. She was wearing it the day she was killed." The world seemed to tilt beneath Ilara's feet. "Killed?" "By the Spanish during a raid on Tortuga." His jaw clenched. "I was away hunting a prize. When I returned—" He stopped, and the silence that followed was heavy with old horrors. "They burned everything. Took anyone they didn't kill. I searched for weeks, followed every lead, paid every informant. But Marissa had vanished completely. I assumed she was dead. I hoped she was dead because the alternative—" He turned to her then, and the nakedness in his expression made Ilara's heart ache. But she wasn't dead. She was alive somewhere long enough to bear a child and give them that pendant. Which means everything I believed, everything I've done for the past 16 years. He laughed, a broken sound. "Tell me, girl, how old are you?" 22, Ilara whispered. 22. He absorbed this. "So you were born 6 years after our marriage. Which means either Marissa survived the raid and hid from me, or—" He stopped, seeming unable to complete the thought. "What do you remember of her? Did she ever speak of before?" "Almost nothing. She said the past was dead, and dwelling on it was poison. The only thing she ever told me was that she'd made choices she regretted, but that I was not one of them." Ilara touched the pendant. "She made me promise never to speak of the crest to anyone, never to try to find out what it meant. She said it would only bring danger. She was right about that." The captain's expression hardened again. "The question now is what to do with you. My crew saw that pendant. They'll have questions, and pirates are not known for their discretion. Word will spread that someone bearing my wife's crest was found alive, and there are many people who would be very interested in that information, people who would pay handsomely, or kill without hesitation to learn what you know about Marissa's fate. But I don't know anything." Ilara protested. "I'm telling you the truth. I believe you." The admission seemed to cost him. "But truth doesn't matter to men like the governor of Kingston or the Spanish commanders who still hunt me. What matters is what they think you know." He studied her again, and she could see him making calculations, weighing options. "I could leave you here. It would be safer for everyone." Terror spiked through her. "Please, but Marissa would haunt me to my grave if I left her daughter to die on a rock in the middle of nowhere, assuming you are her daughter." He said it almost to himself. "No, you're coming aboard. But understand this, girl. You're not a passenger, and you're certainly not a guest. You're either a prisoner or a spy, and until I determine which, you'll be watched constantly. Try to escape. Try to signal another ship. Try anything that even smells like betrayal, and I'll put a bullet in you myself. Am I clear?" Ilara's throat was dry, but she managed to nod. "Crystal. Good." He turned toward the longboat, then paused. "What do they call you?" "Ilara Cole." Cole. He tasted the name like something bitter. "I'm Captain Nathaniel Cross of the Shadow's Mercy. Welcome aboard." "Ilara Cole. Let's hope you survive the experience." He strode toward the longboat without looking back, leaving Ilara to follow on trembling legs, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and the pendant that had somehow connected her to a past she'd never known, and a future more dangerous than any storm. The Shadow's Mercy was larger than Ilara had expected, a 3-masted brigantine that moved through the water with deadly grace. As the longboat approached, she counted 12 guns on the visible side alone, their barrels gleaming dully in the afternoon sun. The crew lined the rails, watching her ascent up the rope ladder, with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Captain Cross climbed ahead of her, moving with the ease of long practice, while Kofi came behind, insurance against any thoughts of escape. Though where exactly she would escape to in the middle of the ocean, Ilara couldn't imagine. Her hands, still weak from weeks of malnutrition, shook as she gripped the rough rope, and she nearly lost her hold. But Kofi's massive hand steadied her from below without comment when she finally tumbled over the rail onto the deck. 36 pairs of eyes fixed on her like she was some exotic creature hauled up from the depths. The crew was more diverse than she'd expected. Men and women of every shade and nationality, united by the roughness of their trade. Some looked barely older than children. Others were grizzled veterans with more scars than teeth. All were armed, Captain Cross stood at the quarterdeck rail, arms crossed, watching the scene play out with those storm-grey eyes. Lucia, the female pirate from the beach, stood beside him, whispering something that made his jaw tighten. "Listen up," Cross's voice carried across the deck with easy authority. "This is Elara Cole. She's shipwrecked, and she'll be staying with us until I decide otherwise. Anyone who touches her answers to me. Anyone who bothers her answers to me. Anyone who so much as looks at her wrong answers to me. Understood?" A rumble of acknowledgement rippled through the crew, though Elara didn't miss the calculating looks some of them gave her. She was acutely aware of her appearance, skeletal, sunburned, dressed in rags, and of the vulnerability of her position. These were pirates, men and women who lived outside the law, who took what they wanted by force. The captain's protection was all that stood between her and chaos. "Lucia," Cross continued, "she's in your charge. Get her fed, cleaned up, and find her something to wear that won't fall apart in the next stiff breeze. She bunks with you in the officers' quarters." Lucia's expression suggested she'd rather bunk with a sea serpent, but she nodded curtly. "Aye, Captain." Cross turned away without another glance at Elara, disappearing into the captain's cabin at the stern. The crew dispersed slowly, returning to their duties with frequent backward glances. Lucia descended from the quarterdeck and stopped in front of Elara, looking her up and down with the critical eye of someone assessing livestock. "Well," she said finally, "at least you're not crying. That's something. Come on then. Let's see if we can make you look less like death warmed over." Elara followed her below decks, down a narrow companionway lit by swaying lanterns. The ship smelled of tar, salt, and too many bodies in too small a space, but it was cleaner than she'd expected. Lucia led her to a small cabin that held 4 hammocks, a trunk, and little else. "This is home," Lucia said, gesturing around. "You get the hammock in the corner. Don't touch anyone else's things, don't ask personal questions, and don't cause trouble. The other women who bunk here are all right, but they won't take kindly to you making waves." "I won't cause trouble," Elara said quietly. "I'm just grateful to be off that island." Lucia studied her for a long moment, and some of the hardness in her expression softened fractionally. "Yeah, I bet you are. 3 weeks alone would drive most people mad. The fact that you kept your wits about you says something." She opened the trunk and pulled out a bundle of clothes. "These should fit, more or less. Get changed, then come find me in the galley. You need food before you collapse." The clothes were men's breeches, a loose white shirt, and a leather vest, all worn but clean. Elara changed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar fastenings. The breeches felt strange after a lifetime in skirts, but they were practical in a way her dress had never been. She kept the pendant on, tucking it beneath the shirt. When she emerged, Lucia led her through the ship, pointing out key locations. "Galley's here where we eat. Heads that way. That's the privy, if you're wondering. Don't go into the captain's cabin uninvited unless you fancy being shot. Same goes for the cargo hold. We're particular about our prizes. Stick to the main deck and the officers' quarters and you'll be fine." The galley was a cramped space, dominated by a massive iron stove bolted to the floor. A short, rotund man with a completely bald head and an impressive moustache was stirring something in a pot that smelled surprisingly appetizing. "Tomas, this is Elara," Lucia said. "Captain wants her fed." Tomas looked up, and his round face broke into a gap-toothed smile. "Ah, the castaway. You look like you could use a good meal, señorita. Sit, sit." He ladled a thick stew into a bowl and set it before her with a chunk of hard bread. Elara fell on it like a starving dog, manners forgotten. After weeks of figs and crabs and coconuts, the meat and vegetables and rich broth tasted like heaven. She ate 3 bowls before her shrunken stomach finally protested. "Better?" Tomas asked, and she nodded, nearly weeping with gratitude. Over the next few days, Elara fell into the strange rhythm of life aboard the Shadow's Mercy. She learned that Lucia was the quartermaster, second in command and responsible for maintaining discipline and distributing provisions. Kofi was the bosun, overseeing the crew and maintenance of the ship. Tomas the cook doubled as the ship's doctor, though his medical knowledge seemed to consist primarily of, if it bleeds, stop the bleeding. If it's broken, splint it. If it's rotten, cut it off. The nervous young pirate from the beach was called Pip, and despite his jumpy nature, he was apparently one of the best sharpshooters in the Caribbean. The crew treated her with wary curiosity. Some ignored her completely. Others asked careful questions about her shipwreck, probing for inconsistencies in her story. She sensed they were testing her, trying to determine if she was spy or survivor. She answered honestly, having no lies to maintain, and gradually some of the hostility faded, but Captain Cross remained a mystery. She saw him on deck occasionally, conferring with Lucia or Kofi, studying maps, shouting orders as they navigated between islands. He never spoke to her directly, never even looked at her, yet she felt his awareness of her like a physical presence. At night, lying in her hammock, listening to the ship creak and the crew snore, she would think about what he'd told her on the beach. Marissa had been his wife. The pendant had been his gift, which meant, what exactly? Was Ilara his daughter? The timing suggested yes, but Marissa had never mentioned a husband, never spoken of being married. She'd been a servant, or so Ilara had always believed. How did a servant become a pirate captain's wife? On the 5th day aboard, Lucia found her on the main deck, where Ilara had been trying to stay out of the way while the crew worked. The older woman's expression was unreadable. "Captain wants to see you," she said. "In his cabin now." Ilara's heart began to pound. "Did he say why?" "Captain doesn't explain himself to me, girl. He just gives orders." But Lucia's tone wasn't unkind. "Listen, be honest with him. He can smell a lie from a mile away, and he doesn't tolerate deception. Whatever he asks you, tell him the truth." The captain's cabin was larger than Ilara expected, spanning the width of the stern. Maps covered every wall, some framed, others pinned haphazardly. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered in charts, ledgers, and navigation instruments. Behind it, tall windows looked out over the ship's wake, the setting sun turning the water to liquid gold. Captain Cross stood at these windows, hands clasped behind his back, his silhouette dark against the light. He didn't turn when she entered. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair in front of the desk. Ilara sat, her hands twisted in her lap. The silence stretched out, broken only by the creak of the ship and the distant calls of the crew. Finally, Cross turned and moved to sit behind his desk. In the better light, she could see the exhaustion in his face, the shadows under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, "about Marissa. About the timing of things. About you." He pulled a bottle of rum from a drawer and poured 2 glasses, sliding one across to her. When she hesitated, he said, "Drink. You'll need it." The rum burned going down, but it steadied her nerves. Cross drained his own glass and poured another before continuing. "Marissa and I married young. I was 22. She was 19. It was real what we had, not some arrangement or convenience. We chose each other." His fingers tightened around the glass. "She was educated, well-spoken, from a good family in England. She'd come to the Caribbean as a governess, but had ambitions beyond that. She was fierce and brilliant and utterly fearless. When she learned what I did, the piracy, she didn't run. She stayed. She chose this life, chose me." He paused, staring into his rum as if it held answers. "We had 6 good years. 6 years of freedom and danger and love. And then the Spanish came to Tortuga while I was away. They killed dozens, burned the town, took prisoners. When I returned and found Marissa gone, He stopped, his jaw working. "I became someone else, someone darker. I hunted every Spanish ship I could find, killed every officer, showed no mercy. I told myself it was justice, but it was just rage. Rage and grief." He finally looked at her, and Ilara saw the pain in his eyes, raw and unhealed after 16 years. If Marissa survived that raid, if she lived and bore a child and never sent word to me, I need to understand why. I need to know if she was a prisoner, if she was hiding, he swallowed hard. "If she chose to leave me, I can't tell you that," Ilara said softly. I don't know what happened to her before I was born, but I know she loved me. And I know that whatever else was true, she was afraid. She jumped at every loud noise, couldn't stand to be in crowds, had nightmares that made her scream. She was running from something or hiding from someone. That much was clear even to a child. Cross absorbed this, and something in his expression shifted. A prisoner, then, or close enough to one that the distinction doesn't matter. He poured more rum. Tell me everything you remember about her. Every detail, no matter how small. So Ilara did. She told him about Marissa's beautiful singing voice, how she would hum while she worked, about her educated speech and her insistence that Ilara learn to read and write, despite their poverty, about the silver-shot hair she'd kept short, the scar on her left shoulder she'd never explained, her hatred of the Spanish that bordered on obsession, about her final days, the fever that had taken her so quickly, the way she'd gripped Ilara's hand and begged her to stay strong, to never trust easily, to keep the pendant hidden always. Cross listened without interruption, his expression growing more complex with each revelation. When she finished, full dark had fallen outside the windows, and the ship rocked gently on a calm sea. The scar on her shoulder, he said quietly, was from a Spanish blade. She got it defending a friend during a raid 2 years into our marriage. She was proud of it. He stood and moved to one of the maps on the wall, touching it with fingers that trembled slightly. And she did have beautiful singing voice. She used to sing this old English ballad about a girl who waited for her sailor to return from the sea. His voice cracked. She sang it the morning I left for the voyage. The last time I saw her. He turned back to Ilara, and in his face she saw the boy he must have been before grief had carved him into something harder. I believe you're Marissa's daughter. The timing fits, the details fit, and that pendant— He touched his chest unconsciously. But that creates a problem. If you're her daughter, and I was her husband, then by all logic and reason— He stopped, seeming unable to say it. Then you might be my father, Ilara finished. The word strange in her mouth. Might be. We can't know for certain. He returned to his desk, suddenly all business again, the vulnerability locked away. But true or not, people will assume it, and that assumption makes you valuable and vulnerable. There are bounties on my head from 3 nations. The Spanish would love to capture someone with leverage over me. Same goes for rival pirates, merchant companies I've raided, anyone with a grudge. So what do we do? You stay close. You learn to defend yourself, and you prove to my crew that you're not a spy or a liability. His eyes hardened. Starting tomorrow, Lucia will train you. Knife work, basic combat ship duties. You'll earn your place on this crew, or you'll find yourself marooned on the next inhabited island we pass. I won't carry dead weight, daughter or not. Understood? Understood. Good. Now get out. I have work to do. Ilara stood, but paused at the door. Captain Cross, what? She did wait for you, my mother. I don't know what happened or why she didn't find you, but there were times I caught her staring at the sea with this look of— She searched for the right word. Longing. Like she was waiting for something that never came. I think she loved you until the day she died. For a moment, his carefully constructed armor cracked, and the grief beneath was almost unbearable to witness. Then he turned away, his voice rough when he spoke. Thank you for that. Now go. Ilara left him alone with his ghosts and his rum, wondering what she'd gotten herself into, and whether the truth about her mother would set them free or destroy them both. The next 2 weeks transformed Ilara in ways she'd never imagined possible. Lucia proved to be a demanding but fair teacher, drilling her relentlessly in knife combat, rope work, and the 100 small skills required to survive aboard a pirate ship. Her hands, already calloused from the island, developed new layers of toughness. Her muscles, weakened by starvation, slowly rebuilt themselves under Tomas's careful feeding regime. The crew gradually accepted her presence, especially after she proved willing to take on the dirtiest, hardest jobs without complaint. She scrubbed decks, hauled lines, climbed the rigging despite her terror of heights, and learned the complex language of sail and sea. Kofi taught her knots with patient repetition. Pip showed her how to load and fire a pistol, though her aim remained abysmal. Even the most hardened pirates began to nod at her in the mornings, to include her in their rough jokes, but Captain Cross remained distant, speaking to her only when necessary, his manner always formal, always guarded. She would catch him watching her sometimes, when she was working in the rigging, or sharing a meal with the crew, or practicing knife forms with Lucia, his expression unreadable. Once she'd nearly fallen from the shrouds, and she'd seen him move toward her with a flash of real fear before she caught herself. But he'd turned away without a word, leaving her shaken and confused. It was Lucia who finally explained, late one night when they were alone in their cabin. "He's afraid," the quartermaster said, mending a sail by lantern light. "Afraid of losing someone again. Afraid of caring and having it ripped away. After Marissa, he built walls so high and thick that nothing could get through. And now here you are, her ghost made flesh, tearing those walls down just by existing. I don't want to hurt him," Ilara said quietly. "I know. But sometimes the truth hurts worse than any lie." Lucia set down her needle and looked at Ilara with something approaching kindness. "For what it's worth, I think you're good for him. First time in 16 years I've seen anything resembling hope in his eyes, even if it scares him half to death." The turning point came on a sweltering afternoon, 3 weeks into her time aboard the Shadows. Mercy! They'd been tracking a Spanish merchant vessel for 2 days, waiting for the right moment to strike. Ilara had been ordered below decks with Tomas and the other. Non-fighters, a precaution Captain Cross insisted on despite her protests that she could help. But the Spanish ship proved more formidable than expected. It was armed as a merchant vessel but crewed like a warship, a trap designed specifically for pirates. The first broadside caught the Shadow's Mercy by surprise, tearing through the starboard rail and sending deadly splinters flying across the deck. The return fire was fierce, and soon smoke and chaos engulfed both ships as they maneuvered for advantage. Ilara heard the screaming from below, the cries of wounded men, the shouted orders, the thunder of cannons that shook the entire ship. Tomas was gathering his medical supplies when a young pirate, barely 16, was carried down, his leg nearly severed by a cannonball. Blood poured across the floor in pulsing waves. "Hold him down," Tomas ordered, his face grim. "Ilara, I need you to help me. I don't know how. You'll learn fast or he'll die. Now hold his shoulders." For the next hour, Ilara discovered reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. She held down screaming men while Tomas cut and stitched and amputated. She threaded needles with shaking hands, applied pressure to gushing wounds, and learned to distinguish between injuries that could be saved and those that were beyond help. The blood and screams and stench of gunpowder burned themselves into her memory, but she didn't flinch, didn't run, didn't collapse. She worked until her arms were soaked to the elbows in blood and her dress was ruined beyond repair when the battle finally ended, the Spanish ship fleeing with the Shadow's Mercy too. Damaged to pursue, Tomas clasped her shoulder with genuine respect. "You did good, Nina, real good. Not many have the stomach for this work." Captain Cross came below to assess the casualties. 7 dead, 12 wounded, 3 of those unlikely to survive the night. His face was grim as he moved among the injured, offering words of comfort or praise. When he reached the young pirate Ilara had helped save, now sleeping fitfully with his bandaged stump elevated, he turned to find her sitting against the bulkhead, exhausted and blood-spattered. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, recognition, respect, connection. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Instead, he simply nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed more than words could have. That night, as Ilara was trying unsuccessfully to wash the blood from her hands and clothes, Lucia found her on deck. "Captain wants to see you. And before you ask, no, I don't know why, but he seemed different, less closed off." Captain Cross was at his desk when she entered, but he stood immediately, gesturing to the chairs by the window. "Sit, please." The formality was gone from his voice, replaced by something warmer, more uncertain. Ilara sat, suddenly aware of how terrible she must look, still blood-stained. her hair in tangles, exhaustion written in every line of her body. But Cross didn't seem to notice or care. "Tomas tells me you saved 3 men today," he said quietly. "Men who would have bled out if you'd panicked or refused to help. He says you have the hands of a healer and the nerve of a seasoned pirate." "I just did what needed doing," Elara said. "Anyone would have—" "No, not anyone." He leaned forward, his grey eyes intense. "Most people would have frozen or fainted or made excuses. You chose to act despite your fear. That takes courage. Real courage, the kind that can't be taught." He paused, seeming to struggle with something. "Marissa would have been proud of you." "I know I am." The simple statement hit Elara with unexpected force. She'd spent so much of her life invisible, dismissed, unimportant, a burden to her aunt, a servant to be ignored. No one had ever expressed pride in her before, and certainly not this complicated, damaged man who might be her father. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick. "That means more than you know." Cross stood and moved to the windows, his back to her, hands clasped behind him in his habitual pose. "I've been thinking about what happens next. We can't keep sailing aimlessly, hoping the Spanish don't find us. They know this ship now, know we're wounded. They'll hunt us, and eventually they'll catch us." He turned to face her. "I have a plan, but it requires me to trust you completely. And trust is not something I give easily." "What kind of plan?" "There's a man in Port Royal, a former associate of mine who owes me a significant debt. He has connections with the British Navy, information about Spanish shipping routes, and resources we need to properly refit this ship. But Port Royal is crawling with bounty hunters and Navy patrols who would hang me on sight." His expression hardened. "However, a respectable young woman traveling alone, seeking passage to England, would attract no attention at all, especially if she carried a letter of introduction from a dead merchant captain and had a story about surviving a shipwreck." Understanding dawned. "You want me to go into Port Royal, to contact this man on your behalf. His name is Edmund Blackwood. He runs a shipping company as a front for more profitable ventures. You deliver a message, collect what he owes me, and return here. It would take 2, maybe 3 days." He held up a hand as she started to speak. "Before you agree, understand the risks. If you're caught working with me, you'll hang. If you decide to betray me, to go to the authorities to run, I won't be able to stop you. My crew would call me a fool for even considering this. Then why are you?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because Marissa trusted me. Because you've proven yourself a dozen times over in the past 3 weeks. And because," he stopped then continued with visible effort, "because I'm choosing to believe that you're the person you appear to be. My daughter, in spirit if not in blood, someone I can trust." Elara felt tears prick her eyes. She stood, moving to face him directly. "I'll do it. I'll go to Port Royal, deliver your message, and come back. I give you my word." "Why?" The question was almost desperate. "You could walk away. Start a new life far from pirates and danger." "Why would you come back?" "Because you're not the only one who lost something when Marissa died," Elara said softly. "I lost the only family I had. And I think she would want us to find each other again. Not as captain and crew, or even as father and daughter necessarily, but as people who understand loss and survival and the price of trust." She reached up and pulled the pendant from beneath her shirt, holding it between them. "She kept this all those years for a reason. Maybe this is it." Cross stared at the pendant, his jaw working with emotion. Then slowly, he reached into his own shirt and pulled out a matching pendant, identical in every way, except the initials, which read NC. He held it up so they hung side by side, 2 halves of a whole separated by time and tragedy, and now, impossibly reunited. "I had them made as a pair," he said, his voice rough. "One for her, one for me. So we'd always be connected no matter how far apart the sea took us." He looked at Elara, and the walls he'd maintained for so long finally, truly crumbled. "I don't know if you're my daughter by blood. Maybe we'll never know for certain. But I know Marissa loved you, and that's enough. That's more than enough." Elara closed the distance between them and hesitantly put her arms around him. For a heartbeat he stood rigid, unused to affection, to vulnerability. Then his arms came up and he held her tightly, and she felt him shaking with silent sobs he'd held back for 16 years. They stood like that for a long time, two people who'd been alone too long, finding unexpected shelter in each other. When they finally pulled apart, both had tears on their faces, but both were also smiling, tentative, uncertain smiles that held the fragile promise of healing. "We'll leave for Port Royal at dawn," Cross said, wiping his eyes unself-consciously. "Lucia will go with you, make sure you're safe." She's grumbled about it for an hour, but she'll do it because I asked. "Because you matter. I won't let you down," Elara promised. "I know, just come back, all right? I've lost Marissa twice already. I don't think I could survive losing you too." The mission to Port Royal went smoothly. Elara, dressed in respectable clothes provided by Cross and playing the role of traumatized shipwreck survivor, delivered the message to Edmund Blackwood without incident. The man was sharp-eyed and suspicious, but the sight of Cross's pendant and the detailed information only Cross could have known convinced him. He provided gold, detailed maps of Spanish patrol routes, and a contact who could supply gunpowder and shot. Lucia watched the whole exchange with arms crossed, her hand never far from the knife at her belt. But Elara handled herself well, and as they made their way back to where the Shadow's Mercy waited in a hidden cove, the older woman actually smiled. "You did good, girl. Real good. The captain chose right when he trusted you." When they rowed back to the ship and Elara climbed aboard, Captain Cross was waiting at the rail. The relief on his face when he saw her was unmistakable. That night he called the crew together on deck and made an announcement that shocked everyone. "This is Elara Cole," he said, his hand on her shoulder. "Some of you have wondered who she really is, why I took her aboard. The truth is, she's the daughter of someone I loved and lost. She's proven herself brave, capable, and trustworthy. And as of this moment, she's no longer just crew. She's family. Anyone who harms her answers to me with their life. Anyone who protects her earns my gratitude. This is not a request, it's an order." The crew erupted in shouts and cheers. Kofi stepped forward and clasped Elara's hand in his massive paw. "Welcome to the family, little sister." Pip actually hugged her. Even the hardest, most suspicious pirates nodded their acceptance. That night, as the Shadow's Mercy sailed under a sky full of stars, Elara stood at the bow, with Captain Cross beside her. They didn't speak, words weren't necessary. They simply stood together, two people who'd found unexpected redemption in the vast Caribbean Sea, connected by a pendant, by memory, and by the ghost of a woman who'd loved them both. "Marissa would have liked this," Cross said finally, his voice carried away by the wind. "Seeing us together, seeing you strong and free." "I think she knew," Elara replied. "I think that's why she gave me the pendant. She was pointing me toward you, toward this, even if she couldn't make the journey herself. Maybe." He smiled, a real smile that transformed his scarred face. "Or maybe she just knew that neither of us was meant to face the world alone." They sailed on into the night, the Shadow's Mercy cutting through the waves with purpose, carrying them toward a future uncertain but no longer empty. Behind them the past, with all its pain and loss, slowly receded into the darkness. Ahead the horizon glowed with the promise of dawn, of new chances, of a family forged not by blood but by choice, by trust, by the unbreakable bonds of survival and love. Elara touched the pendant at her throat and imagined she could feel her mother's approval, warm as Caribbean sunshine. She'd been alone on that island, abandoned and hopeless. But that isolation had led her here, to this ship, to this strange and dangerous family, to a father who'd been lost but was now found. Sometimes, she realized, the storm that destroys you also carries you exactly where you need to be. And sometimes the most unlikely horizons hold the most beautiful destinations. You just have to be brave enough to sail toward them. The Shadow's Mercy sailed on, bearing them all toward tomorrow, together.